In 1980, a killer couple would commit a string of cruel murders against the backdrop of LA's Sunset Strip.
Total disregard for human life. Just the worst of the worst.
Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy would act out their darkest desires and leave a trail of bloodshed in their wake.
They were absolutely the couple from hell, everybody's worst nightmare.
But what had motivated their sickening crimes?
She had a horrible life filled with abuse, beginning with her own father.
Were Clark and Bundy born to kill? By day, the Sunset Strip is famed as the home of Los Angeles' beautiful people. But as darkness falls, the Strip transforms into a very different scene.
At night, the element comes up. Hollywood's always had that reputation, always had. I worked Vice as a young officer, undercover Vice, and prostitution was heavy in the Hollywood area. It's always been a dark side.
But never as dark as the summer of 1980, when a predator set his sights on the City of Angels.
We first became aware of this series of murders when the two sisters were found in the northeast section of Los Angeles.
The bodies of two young women were found by the side of the freeway.
They would not be the last.
The city of Glendale had discovered a dead female shot in the head.
Working girls began being plucked from the Sunset Strip, murdered, and dumped on the streets and in the hills.
Men who were searching for rattlesnakes lifted the mattress and found her body.
The girls on the Sunset Strip were getting very frightened. They didn't know when the killer was going to strike again.
As the body count climbed, the perpetrator was dubbed the Sunset Slayer, a killer seemingly capable of the most shocking of atrocities.
Another gal who had been decapitated and her body was left behind a restaurant. So gruesome. What we're dealing with is a person who, is vicious as they come, because he not only cut her head off, but he took it with him.
It's straight out of a horror movie. It's everybody's worst fear.
By July, at least 6 young women had been found dead, but investigators were at a loss as to who could be the perpetrator.
So bizarre. I mean, who is this guy? We've never had nothing like this.
It would be only through a seemingly unrelated crime that the extraordinary and unexpected truth would surface. Until now, the victims appeared to be all runaways or prostitutes. That was about to change. Jack Murray was an Australian country singer who'd sought fame and fortune in Hollywood.
Jack and I met at the Jerry Lewis Telethon. They needed volunteers to answer lines and take pledges, so I volunteered. And we just kept talking and talking for hours, and every time I took a break, we'd hook up and talk and talk. And when the telethon was over, he asked me if I'd like to go to breakfast, and I said, sure. And 10 days later, we got married in Vegas.
Jack Murray was an interesting character. He was an absolutely classic fringe Los Angeles person who never quite made it in showbiz.
Jack Murray's dreams of stardom hadn't panned out, but he had a small-scale taste of it at a bar in North Hollywood called the Little Nashville.
My husband liked the adoring fans or the women that would throw themselves at him. Ego. Huge, huge ego.
But in August of 1980, Jack Murray disappeared after his performance.
Normally, he would crash in the van if he drank too much. And then the next morning, then he'd drive home. So I didn't think anything of it until he didn't come home. So then I went to the police and reported him missing.
Spotted with Jack that night was one of the hangers-on at the club, 37-year-old vocational nurse Carol Bundy.
Jack had last been seen with Carol right around closing time.
She was mousy hair, kind of large. And to me, she was like a little mouse.
She was rather short. Her glasses were very thick, like she was nearsighted, extremely nearsighted.
Several days after his disappearance, police received a tip alerting them to the whereabouts of Jack's van, 2 blocks from the bar where he and Carol had been seen.
Neighbors on the street had been complaining about an odor coming from a van.
Jeanette Murray would receive the news she'd been dreading.
They said, they found the van. And I said, he's dead, isn't he? And he said, yeah. I said, well, do I need to go down to the morgue to identify the body? No, ma'am, you don't need to do that.
The detectives had good reason.
His head had been cut off.
And his head was missing.
They didn't want me to go down because there was nobody to recognize.
Jack Murray had been shot, stabbed, mutilated, and beheaded. It appeared he'd been the victim of a homicidal maniac.
I was still at the apartment and a lot of packages would be delivered and I'd have to sign for it. Well, I refused any packages. I thought, oh my God, if I opened up a package, I would just totally freak. I was terrified that I would get a head mailed to me.
As the last person to be seen with Jack, Carol Bundy had been called in for questioning. Accompanying her to the interview was her boyfriend, Doug Clark, and the pair's behavior began to arouse police suspicions.
You still didn't know who these people were, except that they were witnesses and they weren't coming across too well, especially Doug.
There was absolutely nothing to hold Carol and Doug, although Doug was sweating like mad through his T-shirt, and it sort of set off some alarms with detectives.
2 days after the body of Jack Murray was found, Carol Bundy turned up at the hospital where she worked with a shocking story.
She came into rounds at about 7 a.m. is when our rounds start, and said something inappropriate.
Bundy began to tell her co-workers tales of mutilation and murder.
She just stood there and started telling these absolutely shocked nurses what was happening, and the co-workers called the police. The police raced over and surrounded the building, but Carol was able to slip out and go back to her apartment.
The police came in and were looking in her locker, and everybody was afraid that they were going to find a head in the locker.
With Carol avoiding detectives at the hospital, they would make their way to her address, where they were to be confronted by an unexpected revelation.
On August 11th of 1980, we came to this location, which was the residence of Doug Clark and Carol Bundy.
There were detectives beating on her front door, and she met them with some underpants in her hand that she claimed belonged to some of Doug's victims.
Carol claimed that she had killed Jack Murray and that her boyfriend, Doug Clark, was the infamous Sunset Slayer. As a couple, the depths of depravity they had sunk to would stun investigators. In 1980, Carol Bundy and her partner Douglas Clark had been arrested for a series of despicable murders that had plagued Los Angeles' famous Sunset Strip. Bundy would reveal to detectives a sickening tale of how at least 6 young women and 1 man had lost their lives in horrifying fashion. But just who were this killer couple, and how had this madness begun? Carol had met Douglas Clark in 1979 at the Little Nashville, the bar where victim Jack Murray performed.
I saw Doug at Little Nashville. He was a very nice-looking guy.
Clark was a smooth talker with an air of foreign sophistication.
He had a privileged young life. His father was in the Navy. The family traveled. He lived for a while on the atoll of Kwajalein. He lived in India. Then the family sent him to boarding school in Switzerland. He went to the international school in Geneva.
Carol Bundy, however, had a very different upbringing.
Carol was born Carol Mary Peters, and she had a horrible, horrible childhood. Her father was a raging alcoholic. Her mother was alcoholic too. Her mother beat her. And when Carol was 9, her mother rejected her for some reason. She shut her out of the house and wouldn't let her in and kept telling her, "You're not my little girl anymore."
Her mother died when she was like 11 or 12. And then the father wanted her to become the mother for the family. You know, take care of the house and cook the meals and do everything that was necessary that the mother should have been doing.
And the demands went much further than mere housework.
He had her sleep in bed with him and she became his sexual, object kind of thing.
While the young Carol Bundy played the role of housewife, Douglas Clark appeared to be enjoying his adolescence.
He had his first sort of taste of adult sex when he was in Geneva, that there were girls there who were perfectly happy to go out with a young American who had a wonderful record collection and a supply of American whiskey.
Clark considered himself the king of the one-night stands. He would speak French in part. He would quote Shakespeare. He was a very smooth character with a lot of polish to him, really.
But not everyone would fall for Clark's charms. Some considered the young man strange.
There was one young woman that he sort of lunged at her one day and tried to kiss her, and she said she would never forget the look in his eyes, that he had these strange, penetrating eyes that looked not at her, but right through her.
As Carol Bundy grew up, her fortunes didn't improve.
She was an adorable-looking little girl, but she became progressively plain as she grew older. She was a lumpy and unattractive adolescent with a much prettier little sister. She began stealing when she was an adolescent. She became promiscuous. She had very large breasts, and she discovered that was a lure for teenage boys. And she even went out with older men, and she didn't prostitute herself, but she did take money from people she was having sex with.
She certainly had disadvantages. She was overweight, she was homely, she had an astigmatism that made her wear these very thick glasses. So yeah, it was hard for her to find love, and as a result, she became very sexually promiscuous.
Douglas Clark, too, appeared to be developing an unhealthy attitude to sex. Reportedly expelled from the Geneva school, Clark's family sent him to an upscale prep school in the US. There he began to conceal tape recorders in his room.
He was quite the voyeur, and he would seduce young women and audio tape it and play it back for the other students. So he, very young, began to indulge himself in all kinds of sexual practices that were, less than moral, less than desirable.
Doug never stopped bragging about his sexual exploits, and one always has to wonder, I think, when somebody brags too much about their sexual exploits, what they're really trying to hide.
After his privileged schooling, Doug Clark would seemingly not fulfill his potential, eventually finding himself in Los Angeles, working as a boiler operator in a soap factory. Without his own place, he would pick up middle-aged women in country music bars in search of a bed. And it was at the Little Nashville that he met Carol Bundy.
She didn't get along well with people, but I think it was because her own self-esteem was so terrible. She really couldn't relate to people. She felt she really didn't have anything to offer in a relationship.
She was not attractive. She was considerably older than Clark. She had a horrible life filled with abuse, beginning with her own father. She was in multiple abusive relationships. And so when she met Clark, she became obsessed with him and would do anything for attention, anything that he would say. And she did it.
He had said to me that he couldn't quite understand why he was so popular with women when he wasn't even particularly well hung, as he put it.
Every male acquaintance that we talked to hated him. The only people that liked Doug were women of, didn't have much life socially, but odd guy.
He got by on his charm and his seductive manner and his flattery and his veneer of sophistication that impressed women who hadn't been exposed to that kind of thing before.
Doug Clark moved into Carol Bundy's bed. There he began to share his sexual fantasies with her.
She was very sexually attracted to him. And so he told her at one point in time in their relationship that she was no longer sexually satisfying to him. And so they needed to do a bit more.
Doug told her about his fantasies of capturing and subduing a young woman and keeping her in a dungeon as his sex slave. And Carol went along with the fantasy.
Clark saw Bundy as just someone that he could use to help him do what he wanted to do and to gratify himself.
She began to kind of really decompensate in the sense that he was abusing her because he was telling her how she wasn't doing things right and he was tired of her, and then again the cycle began about him putting her down, and then she had to do more and more things to please him, and what else was she going to do? And so she just spiraled down again.
With the couple both in custody as suspects in the Sunset Strip murders, Carol Bundy told investigators how their dark fantasies had slipped over into reality. The story had begun 2 months earlier, in June, with the disappearance of 2 teenage girls. 15-year-old Gina Morano and her 16-year-old stepsister, Cynthia Chandler, had a reputation as runaways and recently had begun to turn towards prostitution.
In order to make some money or cash, you got to live. The oldest one, Cindy, was the one that went out to prostitution. The young one wasn't into it, but she was always with her.
Their parents had been out looking for them on the night that their bodies were discovered. They'd been looking for them for days.
On June the 12th, the 2 teenagers were found laying face down amongst the scrub, beside the freeway.
They had both been shot in the head, and Cindy had also been shot in the chest. From looking at the condition of the clothing, they had appeared to have been a necrophiliac element to the case because of the way young Cindy's pink jumpsuit was slit up the side. And one of the detectives in the case felt that there would have been no need to remove her clothing that way had she been alive.
Carol Bundy would claim that after she had discovered bloody clothes in her car, Doug Clark had confessed the crimes to her.
He did tell her that he had picked the girls up on Sunset Strip. They were sitting on a bus bench waiting for a ride. He wanted the girls to perform oral sex on him, and they resisted. They didn't want to. He claimed that they just wanted his money, and he was angry. He claimed that he eventually persuaded the little blonde girl, Cindy, and while her head was in his lap, he turned around and shot her sister, Gina. That frightened Cindy, who moved up, and then he then shot her. And he then drove them to a garage that he had in the San Fernando Valley in Burbank.
In there, he posed them and did all kinds of things to them before he then eventually dumped them out to be found. So clearly he's indulging his necrophilic fantasies both with Carol and without Carol.
But it seems, despite the couple's shared fantasies, Carol Bundy may have had reservations. On the 14th of June, Carol made an anonymous call to detectives investigating the murders of Cindy and Gina. But the switchboard accidentally cut her off. She did not call back. Detectives later found out that Bundy would go from trying to blow the whistle on Clark to the other extreme, as she began to involve herself in Clark's twisted pastime.
Doug Clark would go out looking for prostitutes.
Carol was using her motherly Mrs. Average America, as she liked to call herself, appearance to make the girls feel safe and get them into the car.
She would lead them on, you know, and they would jump in the car and be happy and think they're gonna, you know, come out ahead, and then the story went downhill, you know.
That's what his thing was. Getting orally copulated and shoot him in the head, that is sick. I mean, but that's Doug Clark.
It's pretty deviant behavior. I would say that it's a natural occurrence of life as that individuals want to do more of it. He enjoyed very much what he was doing. He seemed to be getting away with it. He had a good technique in as much as he could use Bundy to help him get victims, and he seems to just want to continue to do it more and more.
However, simply being along for the ride would no longer be enough for Carol Bundy. And soon she would join Clark in indulging a deadly fantasy. In 1980, Doug Clark brutally murdered half-sisters Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano. He confessed to his girlfriend, Carol Bundy, whose first reaction was to call the police. However, she would quickly have a change of heart. Not only would the shock of the murders wear off, but Carol Bundy would begin to fuel Clark's fantasies further and take an active part in murder. On the 20th of June, Carol Bundy was due to commit her first murder. The deadly duo headed to the Strip, where they picked up a prostitute, calling herself Kathy.
Carol described Kathy as a sweet, obliging little girl, little blonde girl of about 17, who hesitated to get in the car, but did. Carol was in the back seat with her gun, and Doug was in the front seat with Kathy.
Sitting on the back seat, Carol was supposed to signal to Doug Clark if she wanted to shoot the girl herself.
Everything got a little confused, and in the whole process, Doug ended up shooting Kathy. They just kept driving and driving, and Carol was trying to get her clothes off. Later, Carol would say it's a bitch to try and get the clothes off a dying girl.
Clark's twisted behavior would continue to escalate, and it would be his desire to act out his darkest fantasies that would lead to the deaths of Karen Jones and Exie Wilson.
The next case that happened was the case of two prostitutes who had come out to Los Angeles from Arkansas. And they were up on the Sunset Strip. They had been together at Connie's Restaurant, which is a sort of railroad car hamburger joint up on Sunset.
As dawn broke on the 23rd of June, the corpse of 24-year-old prostitute Karen Jones was found behind a Burbank steakhouse.
The city of Glendale had discovered a dead female shot in the head, who was later identified as Karen Jones.
Karen was actually a young college dropout. She was in college on a scholarship, and she became pregnant and had a young son, and she had turned to prostitution to support herself and her young child. And that's why she had come out to California.
Later that same morning, Detective Leroy Orozco would be called to an alleyway in Studio City. There he would uncover evidence of a crime of disturbing savagery.
The workers of the restaurant had arrived early and came to throw the trash out. This is when they saw a body laying there.
The young girl's head had been removed and could not be found at the scene.
We came up and down checking, or had officers, checking the trash containers in hope that they would find the head, thinking that that was a possibility.
We ran her fingerprints through the FBI, and we got identification that she was Exie Wilson from Little Rock, Arkansas, had numerous arrests for prostitution.
However, it wouldn't be until 4 days later, when a horrifying discovery was made, that the extent of the killer's cruel disposition would become apparent.
A man driving home one night saw a wooden chest in an alley behind his apartment building.
This is the alley.
He went over thinking, hopefully thinking that there's something of value in it, and it became shocking to him when he opened it. And there was something hard wrapped in clothing.
They discovered the remains of a human head inside.
Exie Wilson's head was found inside an ornate wooden box.
The coroner's representative got there and he's checking the body, and he puts a thermometer in the throat area, checking for the temperature of the body at the time you find it in the ambient temperature or so forth. He said, "This is frozen."
Carol Bundy's confession would reveal the depths of depravity to which she and Clark had sunk. She explained how, in this instance, Clark had gone out on his own.
Doug went on the prowl, and he saw Exie. He tried to pick Exie up, but Exie cussed him out. Doug didn't like that.
Exie and Karen Jones were together, and he had trouble separating them, but eventually Exie came and got into his car. He thought Exie was rude, he thought she was vulgar, and he didn't need much of an excuse, let's face it, from Doug's point of view, to shoot someone.
And then once you got her, you got her in a position you wanted and shot her in the head.
Clark took Exie's body across the Hollywood Hills, and in the parking lot, he got what he called the kill bag out of the trunk of his car. The paper bag with paper towels and rubber gloves and boning knives and disinfectant. He proceeded to decapitate Exie. After Doug had put the head in the trunk of the car, he became concerned that Karen Jones might be able to identify him because she had been with Exie.
He picks up Karen. No problem. She gets in the car, and he ends up killing her.
He shot her in the head, rolled her out of the car, and sped off. And her body was found in the gutter the next day.
And Doug kept a trophy from his night's killing.
Doug brought Exie's head home.
But it would be the revelation of what the couple would do next with the severed head of Exie Wilson that would most astound and horrify investigators. Rather than being repulsed at the sight of her partner's vulgar trophy, Carol was excited by the prospect of joining him in his perversions.
They hung onto the head for a few days and kept it in the freezer. Carol would make the head up every morning, and Doug would then take Exie's head into the shower and use it as a masturbation device.
Absolutely beyond comprehension. The first time I heard that from her, I just couldn't believe that that could have happened, you know. It's like there's just no way in the world. How could anybody do that? You know, cutting off a head is not such an easy task. And then, you know, take it home and fix it up. I mean, that really is terribly psychotic, I think.
In talking to Carol, one of the questions I asked her was, you know, you did this for how long? And she says, well, for a couple of days. And I said, you sound like you're enjoying this. Oh, yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun because it would please Doug. Okay. So I said, well, why'd you get rid of it? And there, Carol, being Carol, I said, well, Leroy, you know, it's a bitch putting lipstick on a frozen face.
What happens is, as you commit more and more crimes, and the crimes become more and more deviant, everything seems to become normalized, and nothing is shocking or offensive anymore to individuals who are behaving this way.
Carol would go on to link Clark to the murder of another girl, a crime which was as yet still unsolved.
Snake hunters up in a mountainous sort of area discovered the mummified body of a young woman. She turned out to be a 17-year-old runaway from Sacramento, young prostitute named Marnette Comer.
This is the area where Marnette Comer's body was found, placed through with old mattresses and furniture. The body had been at the location approximately 3 weeks, and this is in August. The heat, badly decomposed. Although we were able to obtain a bullet from her skull, which matched the murder weapon on the other cases.
Clark had told Carol that he had slit Marnette's belly because he wanted her to rot quickly.
The body of another unidentified young woman would soon also be discovered in the Hollywood area. But why would country singer Jack Murray meet his demise? A murder Carol Bundy claimed all for herself. She and Jack had met a year and a half earlier, when Bundy, with her 2 kids in tow, had moved into a new apartment.
Carol came into the picture when he was managing Valerio Gardens. She came looking for a place to live with these 2 little boys.
She was quickly attracted to manager and maintenance man Jack and would go to great effort to draw his attention.
She'd do things like she took her son's underwear and shoved it down the drain so that the sink would overflow, so that she'd call him to come up, and he'd come up to her apartment to fix the sink, and then he'd be pulling out, here's the little boy's panties that are down the drain, so she could say, oh, he must have done that. That must have been what he did. But it was what she did to get him to go up there.
Carol's kind of free. She looked for everybody for sex. And she was made no bones about it, you know. So she would be the type that could walk up and tell you what she wants to do.
The pair would develop a relationship, but Murray appeared to have ulterior motives.
Jack was a scammer, and he used Carol Bundy, and he made no bones about it when he was talking to his friends. He said she gave great sex, and that was all he was interested in, that and her money. Carol had opened a joint safety deposit box, and Jack had stolen from it.
During her interrogation, Carol would tell investigators of Doug's desire that a woman should be willing to kill for him.
He had told Carol earlier in their relationship that he wanted a woman who would kill for him. And Carol was excited by that.
She really thought that then that would mean that he would love her, you know. And that's what she wanted, you know. She wanted him to love her, you know, because then that gave her something. She had an identity then. Without him, she had nothing.
It would be her eagerness to please her man that led Carol to carry out the brutal execution of Jack Murray.
Doug absolutely hated Jack because he saw him as a rival for Carol's attentions and Carol's money.
Doug had told her that she had to kill her ex-lover, Jack Murray. She killed him and she cut off his head because that, to Doug, meant that she really still loved Doug and not Jack.
She comes home and tells Doug, no, I brought Jack with me. And he flips out because he don't go, oh, you cussing her out. What are you doing? And then she brings the bag in to show him the head. And they just laughed. I mean, they were enjoying the fact that she showed him.
She's just not a compliant accomplice. This is a woman who can not only murder someone, but behead him and carry the head around.
You know, if your head's gone, you really aren't there anymore. You're not that person. And so Jack wasn't around anymore, you know, in fantasy or in reality, you know.
Later on, she would say, it's fun to kill, it really is. And she meant it. She actually enjoyed it. And she thought that would bind them together.
Throughout Doug's time in custody, he fiercely denied the allegations levelled against him by his lover, and in a bizarre twist, would claim that it was in fact Carol and Jack that were the killers.
During the whole process, you know, Doug, you know, said he was innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. It was all Carol and Jack Murray, that they were the ones committing the murder. That Carol killed Jack because she was afraid he was going to go to the police.
And he has not wavered from that defense since then, in 33 years now, since the murders happened.
However, evidence would soon surface that would render Clark's claims of innocence futile. In 1980, the deadly duo Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy were arrested for murders dubbed the Sunset Strip slayings. When arrested, Carol decided to tell all, but Clark was adamant he was not guilty. However, a search of Clark's workplace would put the final piece of this sordid puzzle into place.
The guns were nowhere to be found. They were not in the apartment, and they couldn't find them in the cars.
We thought place of employment. We went to the ownership and asked them about, we'd like to come in with a search warrant.
They wanted to search the Juergens factory, but the factory was not happy about having to shut the place down, the boilers down.
So what the owners did was have the employees search the area before we had the warrant. And in the stairway leading up towards the tower, the top of the boiler, an employee found a brick that was loose in a vent area. And when he stood up higher on the ladder, he found a small purse
containing the two Raven guns that Doug and Carol called the toys, and that were the murder weapons.
It seemed the game was up, but Douglas Clark did not intend on going down without a fight. In court, Doug would continue to deny his involvement in the crimes and began to put on a performance for judge and jury.
The bizarre thing was in court that he tried to model himself after the prosecutor. So there was Clark in his pinstripe suit, sounding lawyerly, and he did sound lawyerly.
When he went to court, he acted as his own attorney, which shows nothing but arrogance and narcissism, and he knew that they had so much evidence against him, he just wanted to put on a show. Anybody who would act as their own attorney has a fool for a client.
However, the facade would begin to slip, and his attempts to paint himself as an upstanding citizen would unravel.
He would just go off the rails and kick the table across the courtroom and start screaming obscenities at the judge.
He used the courtroom as a stage, as a platform, to have one last show, to show the world how cool he is or how great he is. This is all in his mind.
In 1983, Doug Clark would be sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in California. As a result of a plea bargain in exchange for her testimony against Clark, Carol Bundy would be sentenced to life imprisonment. The story of Doug Clark and Carol Bundy would leave a distinctive mark on those who encountered them.
Everybody at the hospital was just mortified that we had been working side by side with this woman and didn't know. I mean, who knows? I could have been a victim. She could have liked the way I looked and, said, I have a guy for you to meet and, come on over, and I probably would have went.
So what had driven Doug Clark and Carol Bundy to take their fantasies to the ultimate extreme? Was murder in their makeup?
I don't think Carol was born to be evil. I think Carol was created to be evil by Doug and what was going on around her.
Given her background, it would be inevitable that she would have a terrible end to her life. One way or another kind of thing. She would have either been beaten up or killed or something like that would have happened to her. Or she would have met somebody like Doug and been out busy killing,
Certainly, Bundy wasn't a born killer. She had a very, very abusive life, and she would do almost anything at that later stage if a man just paid attention to her.
I would very much doubt that Carol would have killed if she had not met Douglas Clark. And clearly she was a sociopath, but not homicidal with it until it became fused with her sexual relationship with Doug Clark and her need to hang on to him and please him.
I don't think Carol was a born killer, but I think it was very easy for him to manipulate her into doing the things that she did.
Clark's a different story. There's something within him at a very early age where he became quite narcissistic and used people to gratify himself, to enhance himself, to particularly enhance his ego. He certainly had a predisposition or an inclination to behave in ways where he didn't connect emotionally with other humans. He functioned in a much detached way where he really didn't care about anybody else other than himself.
I think Doug Clark was a born killer. I don't think there's any doubt that eventually the way he developed meant he would eventually kill somebody because of his fantasies really required dead bodies.
In 2003, having spent 23 years behind bars, Carol Bundy died of heart failure in her cell. To this day, Doug Clark claims that he's been convicted of crimes that he did not commit.
Doug is still trying to convince people that he's not the real killer.
If you were to describe himself, He's just an everyday working guy, 9-to-5 guy. And he says, that's a sick guy you're looking for. That's not me. Well, we're looking at him.
What is certain is that many are still living with the scars of these depraved crimes. Jeanette Murray was even denied the comfort of burying her husband.
We ended up having to cremate him because, there was nothing. They went to the dumpster to try to find the head, but after a whole week of trash being dumped on it, there was no way that they could find it.